Hello and welcome to today's webcast on Cloud FinOps cost allocation brought to you by Insight and Microsoft. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured, and there will be a Q&A during the last few minutes of the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I would now like to turn over this presentation to our speakers, Marcus and Jeff. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Thank you all for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Today we're talking a little bit about a specific topic within FinOps, which is the topic of cost allocation, which is a big challenge for a lot of organizations that's, are spending in the cloud and trying to figure out, who's spending what, are we being efficient, and how do we actually, hold users accountable for their spend. So my name is Marcus Benson. I'm National Principal Architect of FinOps here at Insight, former Microsoft Global Black Belt. And with me today, I have Jeff Amos from Microsoft. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's a pleasure presenting again with you, Marcus. My name is Jeff Amos. I am a cloud financial architect at Microsoft, and I typically explain that by saying I'm a data center architect that likes to do his own taxes. Really helping customers do those cost analytics and increasing the efficiencies of their IT investment. So this particular subject today in around cost allocation is super critical because you want to be able to trend your efficiencies of spend over time and categorize it appropriately and measure it and create KPIs attached to those. And I think Marcus mostly is going to be driving the presentation today, and I'm hopefully going to add in some additional insight and experiences that we've had from a customer perspective.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you joining us today, Jeff, as always. So today's topics, again, it's really going to be focused around cost allocation today. So we'll talk a little bit about what cost allocation actually is, how do you define it, what are the differences between things like showback and chargeback, how do you actually create the right level of visibility and the right level of data within your cloud spend to actually break down spend. What's the RACI chart look like for cost allocation activities? What are some of the challenges and considerations that organizations have to account for when building out a cost allocation model? What are some of the shared cost allocation models that are available today that are most commonly used? And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that are out there that can help you through this, including a demo of a Microsoft-specific tool, the Cost Management Cost Allocation module, which is built into the Azure portal. And then we'll finally get to some Q&A at the end of this and hopefully answer all of your questions. So what is cost allocation? Cost allocation is really the process of being able to break up your bill among those who actually consume the resources. And that could be by a bunch of different categories. That could be by cost centers, if you're utilizing a cost center structure within your organization. It could be by projects, by applications that are running in the cloud, or it could be by departments or business units, or even customer-facing versus external-facing resources. There's a lot of different ways to kind of break down spend, and depending on your challenges, that might define the model that you choose. And just to be aware, there's really no one model that fits all customers. Every customer has, their own ins and outs, their own implications that need to be accounted for when you're starting to build out and think about building out a model like this. And to be done well, to be able to allocate spend accurately, it does require good financial governance. So you'll hear us talk a little bit about governance today in the Cloud Adoption Framework and why that matters when you're actually building out this model. And the goal of cost allocation really should be to allocate all spend, every dollar. If there's shared services, if there's IT charges that are tacked on to spend due to central IT functions, those all need to be included in that spend that's being shown back to the various businesses so they can be aware and accountable for that. And most commonly, cost allocation or showback and chargeback is really a monthly activity. So, what's the difference between showback versus chargeback? You'll hear both these terms thrown around quite a bit. Barry Whittle from Apptio, really said it best when he said, showback leaves a bill on the table for analysis, and chargeback leaves the same bill but requires payment. So that's the difference. Showback and chargeback is really going to be the same data. It's just going to depend on whether or not you require payment.
Yeah. Oh, quick note on that, and kind of an experience even from the Microsoft side. Internally, we started with a showback type of model into the business units and some of the product teams, just so those organizations had visibility into their spend and they could kind of plan for that chargeback type of model. So you could think of it the same way the FinOps Foundation categorizes that crawl, walk, run type of maturity level, is you might start with that showback and evolve into the chargeback as it becomes more transparent with respect to spend and its allocation to the different consuming groups, business units or product units, for example.
Yeah, thanks for that. And as you mature, through that model, the challenges that you're going to face and that come up from things like showback and chargeback will also evolve with that maturity. So as you get more mature and start bringing in things like containerized workloads, that brings with it another set of challenges around how do you actually show back and charge back things like containerized workloads, which are much more difficult to get to that level of detail.
Yeah.
So showback and chargeback is a very, very important activity of what the FinOps Foundation calls the informed phase. So the first phase of FinOps, which is creating the right visibility. And you'll notice a few of these boxes here under inform, directly relate to showback and chargeback and allocation of spend. So things like understanding fully loaded costs, again, to be able to show back and charge back spend, you should be allocating all of that spend. So everything that's shared, everything that's added on, that needs to be included. So creating visibility into spend is obviously a big activity when creating showback and chargeback reporting. And the other big box here that sticks out to me from a cost allocation standpoint is tagging strategy. And maybe it's not tagging strategy. This is actually a little broader than tagging strategy, in my opinion. It could be, account hierarchies that define this as well. But the big goal here is resource consistency. You need to have resource consistency across your organization and the right data at the right levels to support, your chargeback or showback. So again, I mentioned governance is really a key pillar to be able to, do showback and chargeback and allocate spend effectively. It's also going to be a big driver in your coverage of cost allocation keys and tags and things like that. When you're designing your organization, cost allocation should be something that is considered from the top down when you're building this out. How am I actually going to break down spend and be able to break this out to the business? But also, how do we put guardrails around these different areas of our business? And those two discussions are not separate. Those really need to be had together. So building out that subscription structure will help define a lot of the cost allocation, or can help define a lot of the cost allocation. Subscription is really that first main billing boundary within Azure, and is really the oldest billing boundary. Before tags, before resource groups were around, a lot of these customers that started in the cloud early only had subscriptions as their billing boundary. So a lot of customers use subscriptions to break down their costs by those different groups to provide that greater accuracy. Now, tagging is another way to get even more granular into that, but tagging does have its own set of challenges as well. Tagging is difficult to enforce. Tagging can be inconsistent if users are capitalizing or lowercasing things when they shouldn't be, misspelling tags. And not every service within Azure today is taggable. So there's still a certain set of services that even if you do have 100% tagging coverage through policy, you're still going to have gaps in your spend in that allocation model that you need to account for. And naming as well is really kind of that first level of tagging that you have. So naming standards can really help you drive automation of tagging. So if you're being prescriptive about your naming and you're including things like environment indicators and subscription names, or business unit indicators and subscription names, you can actually use automation and Azure policy to tag those subscriptions and resource groups under those subscriptions with their cost centers, their business units, with their environments, all through automation. So it's very important to think about this from the start, because this can really take a lot of those activities and responsibilities, off the hands of the workload owners themselves, and those workload owners already have a ton of competing priorities. So anything you can do to take that responsibility off of their plate will help you be more successful.
Cool. Oh, yeah, let me add a little bit about tags, because you're exactly right. It's kind of a moving target, and it's hard for most customers. That's one of their biggest challenges is how do we leverage tags in some way? And you're exactly right about some of the complexities and some of the gotchas. But do leverage them where they make sense. Like, for example, we have customers moving workloads from on-premise data centers into Azure or AWS, and they'll add a tag that denotes where that resource started, where it was on-premise, so they can actually track and trend the cash flow changes over time to know if they're actually effectively investing, if they're lowering their price point per gig or per vCPU assignment for a VM over time. So they are useful, but Marcus was exactly right. Setting up like a concrete taxonomy on how those resources are tagged, so you can have those views within your reports eventually within those data sets in the longer term is super useful. So I personally kind of have a love-hate relationship with tags. They're amazingly useful, but at the same time, it's easy to make some mistakes. And that's also a good thing to keep in mind is they're a very dynamic field. So you're able to give a couple of things a try, and if they don't work out, reclassify the spend based off of the base data sets. It's a dynamic field, so you can give things a go and make errors and correct them over time as well.
Great points. Thank you. So who's responsible ultimately for cost allocation? Well, it's a mix. Just like FinOps, cost allocation really is a team sport and requires knowledge and accountability and responsibility across different groups in the organization that are utilizing the cloud. So the FinOps team is ultimately accountable for setting the direction of cost allocation, of showback and chargeback, but the app teams are ultimately responsible for making sure that those tags and those keys and that data is there and available on those resources. IT domains should be consulted, because there could be automation, policy, things like that can be leveraged to make this easier on the business. Finance, again, is ultimately responsible as well for ensuring that the data that they need to be able to show back and charge back is included in those tagging standards, is included in those Azure policies, and that data is aggregated across the resources. Sourcing also has a say in this. They're consulted as well, because tagging standards and compliance could have implications on things like procurement models and how things are scheduled on and off for optimization, things of that nature. So there's a lot to be considered. And again, tagging is one of those things that you do need to have those discussions, broad discussions across different functional groups in the organization. And so, there's a lot of challenges and considerations when you're starting to build out this model. The biggest one is there's no model that fits everyone. So, you can't just take a standard and apply it on your organization, because it's most likely not going to work that way. There are best practices, though, that you can take from the cloud providers, from different blogs and posts that can help you accelerate your capabilities here. Obviously, another challenge is engineers don't always tag resources the way that finance needs them to actually break out their spend. So how do you get that consistency? Again, that's that team conversation that needs to happen, that collaboration that needs to happen to be able to drive that. Another challenge is shared costs. So how do you allocate and how do you account for shared spend? Who's responsible for it? How are they getting charged back? How do they see that? And then, if you're purchasing RIs for your organization, when you're showing back and charging back spend, how do you make sure that RI benefits are amortized? How are you accounting for things like blended rates to make sure that, everyone is getting charged back fairly for their utilization, and that RI benefits aren't just jumping around from business unit to business unit every month, making it difficult to predict spend in those different business units themselves. And some other considerations as you're building this too is, if you do have standardization around tagging, do you have a process for ensuring that's correct? How do you allocate or handle unallocated shared costs that may pop up due to lack of appropriate tags or incorrect tags being applied? Do you have a review process for new cost centers, new business units, or new workloads that are coming to the cloud? Do you have a sustainable data modeling approach? How much documentation do you have? Do you have things, shown in processes and with step-by-step instructions? Do you have people that know the system? Or, is there too small of a group that, maybe those processes live in today and you need to start to account for that?
Yeah. And also with some of those questions, look back on how you managed even on-premise data centers and allocated those unallocated costs, as well as some of the shared costs. Like, for example, in data center racks, we have this thing called a PDU, a power distribution unit, basically a glorified power strip. The acquisition cost of that particular device, or even the rack itself, how is that distributed across your business units? And in a very transparent way, because a lot of times we can reuse that model. While we're moving workloads to the cloud, a lot of the allocation mechanisms from the finance perspective aren't dramatically different. They're a bit more dynamic, especially with scalable, like PaaS level meters, for example. But we could re-leverage historically what has already been employed initially and then evolve it over time. So we're not entirely starting from scratch in a lot of cases.
No, and that brings us to the next point. Use what works for your organization. If you already have processes in place that work for the way that your organization is structured, bring those with you into the cloud, if you can.
Exactly. Great point.
Yeah. And so, when you're talking about shared costs, you need to figure out, how do you actually want to allocate this and what model works for me? And there's a few different models that we see most commonly out there, and you'll see this, if you see this graphic here on the right side, this is directly from the FinOps Foundation State of FinOps report from 2022, where they were asked of, what model did they use to split out their shared spend? And the majority of respondents say they don't, split out shared spend at all. But the ones that do, or I'm sorry, proportional is actually the majority still. But 30% of respondents still do not split out any shared costs. But the proportional model is definitely the most popular, and from my experience is the one that we've seen the most. And what that means is the difference between these three different models is proportional just means if a business unit spent 20% of the overall spend for the cloud, for the organization, not including shared costs, then they'll get 20% of the shared cost spend. So proportional to their usage across the organization, that's how they get billed back. Percentage is just a set percentage. So maybe every month, the FinOps team, the finance team works with engineering to set a percentage for their shared cost spend based on the previous month. Or even split is another one that we see. Not as often. Typically it's not as accurate, and there's always going to be some business units that end up getting the short end of the stick if you do a even split model, because that's just saying, if we have $10 of shared spend and we have 10 different business units, everyone gets $1 of shared spend, regardless if they spent, $8 or 50 cents. So that's not always going to work for every organization. That's not going to work for a lot of those business units that are not the big spenders. So really the proportional split is going to be the most accurate and the most fair to share those costs across the org.
Yeah, and a good customer example from my perspective, I work with a large governmental agency in Canada that focuses on statistics. So they're very transactional heavy, and they have different units that are actually using managed SQL instances, some DTU-based models, transactional-based models, or transactional stores in the cloud. and they were looking at how to allocate the shared allocation costs. And they initially took an approach of, well, this particular unit is moving X million transactions, while this other particular business unit is using 100,000 transactions. So let's split it off by that, which initially sounded like a really good approach. But in doing the processing of that allocation, the collection of the data of who's consuming at what scale, it became very problematic. So they resorted back to just a percentage, looking at the scale of overall spend, because it was easier for them to execute, and it had a nominal amount of difference between looking at the transactions one. So the endpoint there is look at the effort to put into it that still creates a fair model to those organizations that are consuming shared resources, and something that's executable in an easy fashion versus an overly taxing fashion where it creates more work for you to actually allocate those costs. So you have to find that balance.
Yeah, it's easy to overcomplicate things and create more work than you need to. So we've seen that a lot of customers as well. So how do you measure your success when it comes to cost allocation? There's, typically the most common KPI that we've seen for cost allocation is the percentage of spend that's allocated. In order to have a good allocation model, you need to be able to allocate, again, fully loaded costs, 100% of that spend. So, from a crawl walk target perspective, typically we see about 80% coverage as a good starting point. And that's typically due to tagging limitations. You are going to have that 15 to 20%. That's really hard to account for and actually, allocate. A run stage target is 90 to 100%. And typically the customers that we see hitting that 100% target are maintaining their tagging and allocation models outside of the cloud. So they're using some kind of, CMDB or, some kind of database where, when subscriptions are requested or provisioned, all of that data is captured and then saved out into that database that they can use to pull in that metadata and do those allocations. And so from an accuracy perspective, the best way to get 100% coverage really is to maintain that outside of the cloud provider, outside of that tag.
Yeah, and I see most customers evolving in that direction, meaning that we provide, and I know you're going to go into tool sets here in a couple of minutes, but there are some embedded tool sets within Azure, AWS, the different cloud providers that kind of give you those views and categorize spend. But especially with the larger customers I work with, they tend to pull down that data via the APIs, the billing and usage data, and do some level of post-processing, some reallocation of like the billing meters that they've actually seen mapped back to the business units and looping in additional data sources, as mentioned, their CMDB or even some of their financial accounting systems so they can map it back to cost center, profit center type of identifiers. So it's a great start, and I think Marcus is going to go into it in a minute, to leverage some of the pre-existing tool sets. But if you start running into limitations, it's a great consideration of, well, should we create our own data factory pipeline to post-process this data, get it at a more granular level and position it in a way that makes sense to the business units, as well as to the different audiences. Like the executives don't want to see day-to-day reports of spend, but they want to see quarterly or something along those lines, as well as the accounting and finance teams want to see maybe every 6 months or per quarter as well. So keeping in mind the audience. But certainly don't be fearful of pulling in the raw data and post-processing it that maps your particular workflow and business process.
Great point. So, cost allocation is all around accountability and creating accountability and spend. Another way to do that, and something that should be used in tandem with your cost allocation modeling, is budgets and alerts. So, instead of at the end of every month, those business units getting that cost allocation report and having to figure out, oh, wow, we overspent to our budget. How do we, kind of pull this back next month? Setting these budgets and alert conditions around thresholds being met of spend for these different groups is a really great way to start making this more of a day-to-day activity for them and keeping eyes on this and making sure that they're not just getting their bill at the end of every month, but they're actually managing their spend. So what tools can you use to do this today? We mentioned there are some native tools out there that can support your cost allocation models and your cost allocation needs. So Microsoft actually has, within the cost management blade, within the Azure portal, a cost allocation model that is, it's still in preview today, but it's definitely, it's a start. It allows you to create some of those shared cost allocation rules to split out spend across different groups, subscriptions, resource groups, or even down to specific tags that you have on your resource. So that's a great resource, and that information will come out in your Azure Cost Management reporting. You can view that directly in the portal. But if you're more of a Power BI user, or Power BI and kind of power user, you can create your own custom allocation models within Power BI, utilizing those native connectors to pull that data down. And then you can create, DAX formulas and all sorts of cool stuff to break out that spend in different unique ways that is a lot more customizable than the native cost allocation module. For monitoring your tagging coverage, if you are relying on tagging as part of that, there are some dashboards to help you do that, like the CCO Insights Governance Dashboard that offers a tagging page, so you can view by different groups, by management groups, by subscriptions, tagging coverage in each of those environments, so you can start to identify what teams are struggling with compliance when it comes to tagging, what teams are struggling with consistency, and you can start to work with those teams to help remediate some of that. And then Azure Policy is going to be really that driving automation that enforces those tagging rules and even can automate and modify some of those tags for you, so that, again, you can take those responsibilities away from the resource owners themselves.
Yeah, and as mentioned, these tool sets are a great start, and it helps set the context of the data that you have access to. And many customers I work with initially are even downloading the data via the portal, importing it into their own transactional store, or like ETL or transform type of data process, and then further mapping it at a more granular level. Yes, yeah. And typically when I engage with customers that are at that level, it's like, well, let's automate this. Let's put it into a data factory pipeline. So the collection and aggregation of data is super solid. It's scheduled, it's in the cloud, and we can really focus on the views, the data aggregations, and delivering to the different audiences that we mentioned, as well as the business units. And so a lot of times I'll see customers start with that embedded experience, that control experience of the cost management Power BI, that's the applet, that's based off of the website, and then quickly evolving into creating their own Power BI representation using Power BI Desktop. And then they realize, well, we want longer-term trending of data. Let's start collecting our own long-term trending of our billing and usage data, as well as from the other cloud providers. And that's where we really start seeing some of the rich KPIs evolve across the different cloud targets, which is an exciting phase, but also we start turning into data analyst, if you will, which is not a bad thing. That's a role that I tend to see within FinOps teams, is a couple of folks that are really super focused on data collection, aggregation, and normalization of the data, regardless of the tool sets, because it's a critical aspect of knowing how we're allocating the costs, and also what we're doing with respect to long-term trending. Not just the last couple months, but the last couple years. Are we increasing our efficiency of investment over time?
Awesome, great points. Thank you, Jeff. So now, with that said, we're going to jump over to a live demo. So I'm going to go ahead and steal the screen share here, and hopefully I don't break everything. So you should now be seeing my screen, which you should be seeing the Azure portal. So within the Azure portal, at the home page, you have the cost management blade that you can go to. It's down here under tools. So when you head over to cost management, the cost allocation preview function is located on the left-hand toolbar under settings. So if you click over to cost allocation preview, you can then start to add and create some cost allocation rules for your organization. So for example, you'll have to name your rule. So we'll just call this shared services. And the first step is to add the sources. So what is the cost that you actually want to distribute? So where are your shared costs actually located? So for example, if we're doing this at a subscription level, I'm part of an organization here called Digital Innovation here at Insight, so DI. And we have an Azure DevOps billing account that is a shared account. So for example, I would add this and say I wanted to just create a DI shared services, so just even for one of my organizations within Insight, I can select the shared subscription, and then I can split that out against all of my other DI subscriptions. Again, selecting everything except for the billing. For example, I'm just going to select these ones here. So now you have these 5 subscriptions that this spend is going to be allocated from against. So in the next step, this is where you'll actually select and choose your shared distribution model. So again, we had the even distribution we mentioned before, so you can set just specific percentages that you want to distribute across these 5 subscriptions. We're going to be even, it's 20% against each. But if we wanted to proportionally distribute, we can select that rule, proportional to total cost. But we can also be a little more tactical about this too. If we want to, we can do this proportional to a compute cost or a storage cost, for example, or even networking costs. Or we can create our own custom percentages here as well. So it does offer some flexibility today. But again, it still does have some limitations. But again, it's better than nothing. It's a great way to start allocating some of those shared service costs. And you can create these rules and have that automatically done just with your own. So, a great tool, great way to get started with cost allocation. And, as you mature, as those capabilities, mature with you and those needs change, maybe this is something that, should be done outside of the portal. But this is, again, a great tool to get you started with cost allocation. Now I am going to go back to the regular program. All right, so quick poll question for the group. How does your organization today handle shared costs? Do you have shared costs? Do you use a proportional distribution model, even split, fixed allocation? Do you allocate all shared costs just to a central IT budget? I guess how does your organization handle this today? And we'll give folks a couple of minutes here to get some answers in, and then we'll talk a little bit about the results. All right.
Oh, that's super common. Shared costs get allocated to central.
Yep. Yeah, that is very common, especially in organizations that maybe just be getting started in the cloud or are just starting to really get more tactical about their cost in the cloud. Typically those costs are just being handled by that central group, that cloud group. But as you mature and as those different teams in the organization start to consume more spend, most organizations we see start to go toward that proportional model.
Yeah, and it kind of maps to IT organizations still being predominantly 99% of the time as a cost center versus being mapped to like revenue streams, being portions of a profit center. But I have a lot of CFOs approach me and ask, well, how do we get into that categorization? We're hosting services that are generating revenue. We want to show impact. What we're spending on our infrastructure directly and should be in alignment with a revenue margin of some sort and that's where we start seeing kind of the evolution of going up to proportional allocation or even allocation based off of actual meters. That's where we have a very mature tagging taxonomy at a granular level. But Yeah, 99% of the time it is that shared cost or proportional, as even IT organizations consider having some representation of revenue.
Well, yeah, this is definitely in alignment with what I would expect to see. So, all right. Well, we'll open it up now if there's any questions that any of the attendees have. I know we have quite a few folks that have hopped on. So feel free to pop any questions in that Q&A box if you have any questions that we can answer. Let me just give it a couple of minutes.
Cool. Yeah, a common question I get is, yeah, how do we get started in a lot of this? And as you look at the tool sets that Marcus walked through, especially some of the budgetary tool sets and the cost allocation tools, going through the portal and working with things that have those pre-created experiences of managing the budgetary allocation and the representation and the visuals is a great start. And as you evolve, get to that crawl phase and even run phases of maturity, you know, digesting the information into your own transactional storage, your own cost allocation, and even finance billing systems. That's like the next level. So a lot of times I'll work customers through what's accessible today, as well as what they want to do in the longer term. Because everything that's available in the Azure portals, whether it's from provisioning and billing and management, and even the budgetary tools, is also accessible through some programmatic interface, some API, if you will. So you could fully extend it. So always keep that in mind. We're not limited to what is just exposed through the portals, but it is a fantastic first step.
Great, thanks for that, Jeff. All right, well, it doesn't look like there are any questions that have come in through the Q&A. So I think we can go ahead and we'll probably stop this here, but you know, please do just, you know, make sure that you keep an eye out because we will be, you know, posting some additional sessions after this. So this is the first of another series that we'll be doing throughout this year. And please, you know, make sure that, you know, you're looking at and viewing the resources as well that you have available to you. I believe on the right-hand toolbar within On24, you should have a bunch of links to resources as well. So feel free to utilize those, and we'll. Oh, I think we actually have.
Before we cut off, it looks like we did have some come through in the Q&A window that we could probably tackle real quick. Let's see, the first one is for companies without dedicated FinOps teams based on the RACI model, which groups usually take responsibility? I'll first add my perspective and then pass it over to Marcus. A lot of times, it depends on the size of the company. Like if it's a larger enterprise or corporation, I see it land within the finance teams. To the extent that I'm even talking to finance folks about what cloud is, what VMs are, and what IaaS meters versus PaaS meters are, so they have an understanding of some of the infrastructure pieces. And so it tends to land in the finance team first, and then kind of cascade back into the technical teams or the operations teams. Because it's finance's goals to increase efficiencies of their investment, especially budgetary allocation to IT or the business units. So it's their foremost concern. And then I see it evolve into a FinOps organization. Typically, those FinOps organizations or those formalized teams within the customer are first positioned as self-funding, meaning that as finance is analyzing different cost constructs they can consume on the cloud targets and realizing a reduction in potential spend, that becomes a self-funding activity to fund a FinOps team and formalize the process longer term. And that's kind of the experience I had. But Marcus, I was kind of curious about some of your observations as well.
Yeah, in organizations that I've seen that don't have a formalized FinOps practice, like you said, a lot of cases, finance is taking that initiative and kind of driving that. But it's typically in tandem with a cloud governance team. So if there's not a FinOps team in place, there's typically at least a cloud governance team or some semblance of a cloud center of excellence team that is setting a lot of the standards in the cloud. So usually it's finance working alongside with one of those teams if there's not a formalized FinOps team in place, because they're the ones that are going to be able to drive the technical capabilities and requirements that will drive the allocation model for your organization.
Cool, cool. And then we had another question come in, and it's a good one and a little bit more challenging. Are there tools on the portal that provide guidance for settling budget? My short answer is kind of, sort of. So there are budget tools within the Azure portal where you can set boundaries of particular like subscription levels, and I think even some of the budgetary tools apply to like resource groups, and so that capability is there. However, the settlement process where you go back and actually audit, the tools aren't quite 100% there yet, because I state that because typically a finance team will have their own budgetary allocation and tracking tools. So it requires some level of automation, pulling down the actual data sets from the budgetary tools of the portal and then mapping that back to your internal tools. So my estimation is they're like 80% there, and you still need to have that 20% connection or automation, maybe some scripts, some code, some ETL processes of data to be able to really have that settlement process in place. So Marcus, I was kind of curious if you could.
Yeah, and you're describing utilizing the Azure cost management budget capabilities and utilizing the cost management APIs to pull those out, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay. For setting budgets, Julie, the Azure cost management tool within the portal, utilizing the budgets screen is definitely going to be the best place to go to create those. And as Jeff mentioned, once those are in there, then you can utilize the APIs to pull that data down into other tools, other finance platforms to monitor those.
Yeah, sorry, I read that one as settling versus setting, but I made the question harder. But certainly for setting budgets, yes, yeah, there's those budgetary tools in there with alerts and those type of mechanisms. I was overthinking it from a CFO perspective of also you want to settle the budget, kind of have that audit workflow type of process.
And we see a lot of customers too just maintaining budgets in their own spreadsheets. Again, if you're maintaining your metadata outside of Azure, maybe you want to take that outside metadata and add budgets to that as well to track that. So that's a great way to do that. Great way to put those, those budgets in where your metadata lives and make sure that that is available.
Cool.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that we had. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next sessions.
Always a pleasure presenting with you, Marcus. Stellar work, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of sessions.
Likewise, Jeff. Thank you all.